Scott, do you want to get things started?
Yes, I will. Thank you. All right, good morning, everybody. I want to welcome everybody to our Prescribed Fire 101. I'm Scott Davis here with EPA Region 4 in Atlanta, Georgia, out of the Southeast Regional Office. We do expect to have over 200 people today, so appreciate everybody being on, as well as your interest in prescribed fire and activities here in the Southeast related to prescribed fire and air quality. Before we get started, I just want to give a brief introduction. This particular webinar, it's being put on as part of our Southeast Prescribed Fire and Air Quality Work Group. This particular work group consists of all of the state air agency directors as well as staff from Region 4, the state forestry fire chiefs from EPA Region 4, and then we also have representatives from other multi-state groups in the Southeast. The Southeast Prescribed Fire and Air Quality Work Group started in 2013, and it's co-led by the Joseph Jones Ecological Research Center, the National Wildfire Council, and EPA Region 4. And within the work group, we do have a planning group that really tries to make sure things keep on track and that we have events to bring everybody together. Just want to recognize the folks that are part of our planning group. For the Jones Center, Mark Melvin is our group member. For the National Wildfire Council, it's Mike Zepko. And then for EPA Region 4, we have myself, Scott Davis, Rick Gillum, and Carol Kempker. Then we also have Jennifer Fawcett from the North Carolina State University, and she is also a member of our planning group and really keeps the work group on track as well. The work group itself, as I said, was started in 2013, and we use it as a forum to exchange state, regional, and national prescribed fire, smoke management, and air quality goals, and to communicate issues among the state forestry, fire agencies, as well as with the state air agencies. We have had what we call smoke summits. We've had these every 2 years, and they started in April 2013 down at the Jones Center. We had our second smoke summit in February 2015, and then most recently we had our smoke summit 3 in April of 2017. And these smoke summits are an opportunity for the group to get together face to face and have about 2.5 days of time for interaction, as well as actually participation in a prescribed fire event at the Jones Center. And we do have periodic conference calls with the work group as well, just to keep us on track and just to keep everybody aware of things that are going on in the world of prescribed fire and air quality in the Southeast. And our next particular work group call is coming up in January. And so today, one of the things that the work group has talked about doing, and we're doing it today, is actually have a Prescribed Fire 101 for air quality specialists in the Southeast. And I realize we do have folks from around the country on, but this one was set up to really give everybody in the Southeast an opportunity to hear from some of the real true experienced professionals out there about prescribed fire. And we're very happy today that we do have Dr. Alan Long and Dr. David Godwin from the Southern Fire Exchange, and they're going to be doing the presentation today. We do have opportunities for questions. We'll have a mid-break for questions and then questions at the end. And I do encourage everybody to ask questions because, as I said, we've got 2 great experts here today to provide information on prescribed fire for all of you. So now I'm going to turn it over to David Godwin, and he'll go through some of the logistics and then kick off the presentation today. So David, you've got it.
So it's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Alan Long. Alan's passion for fire management started in California over 50 years ago. His work with prescribed burning has taken him from the U.S. West Coast to Indonesia and most recently to the southeastern U.S. He has a BS and MS from the University of California, Berkeley, and a Ph.D. from NC State University. He's retired from the University of Florida in June of 2010, but thankfully, I'd say, has remained exceptionally active and involved. and the fire community in the Southeast. And he's the PI and director now for the Southern Fire Exchange Program, and has been for several years now, since the start. And he's most recently was the committee lead and lead cat herder for the wonderfully successful 2017 Association for Fire Ecology, 7th Fire Ecology and Management Congress. That was just a couple weeks ago down in Orlando. So welcome, Alan. Thanks for all that you did at AFA, and we're excited to have you with us today. And just one moment and we'll swap out presentations.
All right, thanks, David. All right, well, thank you for the introduction, David and Scott, and thank you to all of you who are participating. When this was suggested at the Jones Center almost 2 years ago now that we try and do something like this, I just couldn't pass up the chance to volunteer to do it, having been involved in activities like this as a teacher for many years. So I'm glad that you all are on. I hope that you will get something out of this. I presume that in the variety of topics that we're going to try and go through in the next 60 minutes or so, that some of this may be old hat to some of you, to many of you, some it may be new. Hopefully all of you will get something out of it that helps to understand a little bit more about how important prescribed fire is. Certainly in the South, it's becoming of increasing importance, or at least recognizing that it needs to be increasingly important elsewhere in the country. But the fire, the South led the way in the development of it. And we're going to take a look at a variety of topics that are related to that, from the kind of briefly a little bit about fire history in the South to thinking about that fire history. How do you define prescribed fire, and then why do we burn, and then maybe step back to a bit about combustion and the fire triangles, what makes fire behave and move and do the things that it does. And we'll take a short break at that point, and then the last couple topics will zero in a lot more on the specifics of how prescribed fires are actually conducted, and all of it with the attention to the fact that there's a great deal of effort in doing prescribed burning to tend to smoke management. And I hope by the time I get done, you'll have a lot better idea about exactly how all prescribed burners go about tending to that matter of smoke management and smoke issues. So a little bit of an overview. Fire has been a natural process in basically all of North American ecosystems, and especially in the South, as you'll see why in just a second. And most of that has been in the past due to natural ignitions, lightning being the major cause, given that we have no volcanoes in this corner of the world. But over the last 10,000 years or longer, humans have also used fire, and they've lit it for a number of reasons. I'm not really quite sure why or how the earliest ancestors did that in the South, but we certainly know that over the last few thousand years, the Native Americans used it often. They would light it for a variety of purposes, from clearing land for agricultural crops that they had to running game. And then the early settlers, as is kind of down in the lower right picture, used fire a lot for clearing land, for refreshing it for the cattle they ran after the land had been cleared, for protecting homes. And so it had been under a lot of use. And it's only in the last 100 years that people purposely decided to try and control that. Began in the West, but it was almost immediately in the South too, this focused effort on completely controlling any wildfires that occurred and discouraging the use of any human enlightened fires. So why would it have been so prevalent in the South? I presume most of you have seen some graph that looks sort of like this, but with the deepest red colors in Central Florida out into the yellow colors, the South has always had a lot of lightning storms. And those ignitions are most prevalent kind of in the late dry season, going into the storm season of the middle of the summertime, when things get almost too wet for ignition. But in March, April, May, June, lightning was often the cause of significant fire ignitions and production. Besides lightning, though, there's a lot of other ignition sources today, and I list a bunch of these down here as far as humans go. The fourth under humans is the way that we do it, like in the bottom picture, so much for prescribed burning. The others are ways humans have of causing so many of the wildfires today. And under the equipment side of it, there's also been a variety of different kinds of sparks that have been generated. Power lines are an interesting one because there's probably evidence that over the last couple of months, those really devastating fires in California, where at least a few started by power lines that were down by the really high winds. Also evident from California over the last couple of months has been the role of embers playing, because once those fires got started, often it was embers from, for example, in Santa Rosa, from one house to another that really got the fires going. Well, let's back off of that and talk about the natural systems and where fire occurs. And given that it is a natural process, it's a disturbance process that changes successional pathways, kind of the direction that ecosystems will go without any disturbances. They sort of relay from one plant community to another over time. But in a place like the Southeast, where there's very frequent fire, that disturbance most often just causes stand maintenance, a condition like the upper right photo where low intensity fires burn through the ground cover, through the shrubs that are there, all of which either seed back in or resprout almost instantly, and the trees are left largely untouched. Now the second fire down, that's what more often called a stand replacement fire, and that does occur in some places in the South once in a while, places like Sandhill Scrub in Florida. Much more prevalent when you get to the western U.S. and the northern part of North America. And then like the bottom picture on the left is just really minor fires that may dribble around out in the stand and do some fuel reduction. All of these fires recycle nutrients way more quickly than decomposition would do. In some cases, they may reduce pest outbreaks, and they certainly modify and in many cases improve wildlife habitat, because given that most of these plants in these communities are adapted to fire because of the long history of it, so are most of the wildlife species. And some of them, the more endangered ones, like the scrub sparrow on the right side, depend on fire to maintain their habitats. And given that kind of natural process and those ways that fire has occurred naturally, ecologists break the occurrence of fire down into something tangible in terms of they can put labels on them. And so we look at things like fire regimes, which is how frequently fires naturally would have come back. And, you know, it won't be every year or every 2 years or every 50 or 75, but somewhere in those ballparks were fires in these different regimes. So like in the Southern Pines across a good part of the coastal plain and the Piedmont, very frequent fires, anywhere from 1 to 5 year frequency, would have burned through, largely due to lightning, some to the Native Americans, through all the longleaf stands and even into some of the hardwood stands less frequently than that. The more intense, high intensity stand replacement fires are in places like sand pine scrub on the right, or down here when you get up into the conifers that exist up in northern Canada and Alaska. We do have 100-year frequency fires in places like Cyprus, but it only happened on those most severe droughts probably historically. So what happens, as we have done over the last 100 years, and take fire out of so many of these systems? Most of those fire-adapted ecosystems will then continue on that ecological succession pathway, and they fill in with shrubs, as in the top photo, hardwoods down here in the bottom, and both of these you'll recognize as considerably variable or variant from what would have been the natural system. It's under the conditions of these two communities on the right side that actually diversity and mosaic sort of disappear out of that, becomes fairly uniform in all of that understory, and wildfires, when they finally get into those, are more intense and cause more damage to the trees overstory that normally would have not been impacted. And it's under systems like that, whether you're in the west or the east, that if you go counterclockwise from this top left photo of an open stand, that without any fire, imperceptibly and slowly, more things are added into that stand as they seed in, and eventually it becomes a much denser stand and much more prone to higher intensity fires. And I include that picture in the upper right just to point out that that suppression effort has been going on for over 100 years now, when the first fire control policies really were set in place by the federal government. Of course, in 1944, Smokey came along, and he also brought that challenge to control all those fires, but gradually that war philosophy sort of changed into the picture on the right, that poster where his forest friends are now friendly to him, and eventually down on the bottom where they actually were plotting him using a drip torch. But I put this "or has it" actually in here because if you look across the South, you look across anywhere, we still use a massive amount of effort to try and control all wildfires. And it's a necessity in so many places and so many cases because of human developments out into all of those zones where fire occurs. And it's that framework of that natural fire and our suppression in which prescribed fire becomes so important, because it's a mechanism we're doing just like Smokey in the bottom picture, and lighting fires in a way that will allow that natural process to occur without the damage that we've seen in the very large fires. So let me kind of wrap this part up with a comparison between wildfires and prescribed fires, and a couple of things. One is wildfires are unplanned, where when we're conducting prescribed fires under the acceptable conditions, and we'll talk about those shortly. We have no control in a wildfire over where the smoke is going, or the burning conditions for all that smoke production, where we can do a much more thorough job of that smoke management with prescribed fires, illustrating the very bottom right picture, which is a prescribed fire burning up against a community development in eastern Florida. But notice that it was all selected because the wind was going to be blowing the smoke away from that community that day. Unlike the fire in the bottom up in the mountains where all the houses burned. So with that backdrop, let me give a definition of prescribed burning, and then we'll look at some more aspects of it. But this is a prescription, or the prescribed burning definition, that is in Florida law, and it's very similar to most others that are where prescribed burning is defined in various books and resources. The italicized words are important. The application of fire to fuels under a written prescription, specified environmental conditions, appropriate precautionary measures so we can meet land management objectives, and most important, it's confined to the planned fire area. So let me give some statistics on that before we look a little bit more closely at things like those objectives. But, in Florida to date, there's been almost 2 million acres of authorized. That's prescribed fires that have received a state approval to be burned out of 81,000 acres. Now, it may well be, I put those numbers together about a week ago off of the Florida Forest Service webpage. And south of the snow zone over the last week, we've had some very excellent burning conditions, and I suspect that it may be close to the 2 million or over it by now. But out of that 81,000 fires, there was only 78, which is about 1 out of 1,000 fires, prescribed fires, that actually escaped and became a wildfire. That's an incredible testimony to the people who are doing those fires and the planning that they do for those. On the average, over the last 10 years, those escapes have been less than 1%, down in the range of 0.1 to 0.5%. At the same time, if you look back over the last 10 years, there have been about, on the average annually, about 3,000 wildfires in the state, burning 120,000 acres. And 3% of those were escape prescribed burns. So again, a very, very small percentage, but that's a much smaller number than the actual number of authorized fires this year, which is pretty average for most years. Across the South, where we in most years have a year-round fire season in some part of the region, they look at about wildfires of about 45,000 and 1 million acres, kind of ballpark figures, averages. Where at the same time, prescribed fires are being used on over 10 million acres. So again, the wildfires in the South are less than about 10% total in acres than prescribed fires. But you don't hear about most of those prescribed fires because of the attention that's paid to them. So one of the first things in that definition was, what about the objectives? It's got to have some kind of a reason. And when a burn planner or a landowner puts together a burn plan. It's with some major objective, and very often the two most frequent used across the South are either that first one in terms of reducing wildfire hazard by vegetation control or logging debris, removing it, or the bottom one of restoring and maintaining ecosystems, especially those that are fire dependent, both plants and animals. There's also a lot of burning done just as the Native Americans and the early settlers did to remove the stuff that may be in the way of planting seedlings for regeneration after harvesting operations, replacing ground cover on areas that are maybe you're trying to convert over from something that was not natural to the more natural ground cover. So those are three of probably the most important objectives, but there are some others, and are kind of related to that last one of fire-adapted ecosystems. Improving and maintaining wildlife habitat is often a very critical part of those objectives. Burning usually improves forage quality, the amount of it, the accessibility of it, increases mass production, mass being the berries and the seeds, the fruits that the animals eat and need, protects nesting sites and foraging sites for especially different bird species. And a lot of that burning, as you saw in the figure across the South, is done for rangeland and for grazing because of fire effects on quantity and palatability of the forage grasses. It can also be used to reduce shrub and invasive intrusions into those range lands. And once in a while, there's a couple of other objectives, far less control, but one of those, for example, has been used to try and control various pest problems. But beware the invasives, and a lot of invasives across the South, things like Kogan grass and some of the climbing ferns love fire as a way to give them an extra one-up advantage when they come back. Some landowners use it to improve and enhance access, appearance, hunting, and on rare occasions it's been used for thinning pine stands. The longleaf pine in that lower picture is particularly amenable to being burning at that age under the right conditions. Less common in the South for water quality and yield, but very important out west is using prescribed fire to help manage water, especially in the Rocky Mountains. So if I think back to that first objective about saying reducing wildfire hazard, the question comes up, does prescribed fire actually reduce wildfire? And it's been asked by the state agencies, it's been asked by a lot of others. There was an interesting study, this is the only science I'll give you here today, but an interesting study done at Fort Benning, Georgia, where they collected data over a 30-year period. They finally published this 3 years ago, and looking at the relationships between all the prescribed fires that they do on that property, which is about 180,000 acres, and the wildfires that they had on it. And they did most of their burning on 2 to 3 year intervals under the sort of pine stands that you see on the right. Their two questions were, does the wildfire incidence in the area have some relationship to the prescribed fire activity, and is that influenced by weather and drought? These were the results they published over that 30 years. You can see it at the bottom from 82 to 2012. The top graph is the increasing amount of prescribed fire that they did, the acreage in that prescribed fire that they did. Sort of kind of rose up to a peak point in the early 2000s, except for a couple banner years shortly thereafter. But at the same time, if you look at the number of wildfires in the second graph going down, the number of wildfires greatly decreased. Now, those wildfires, some of them are caused by lightning. A lot of them, because of their base mission, are started by artillery and other kinds of arms fire. But the actual acreage of the wildfires also diminished on that bottom graph, except a couple peak years back in '85, and '88, which were really droughty years across the South, and a lot of fires in every region. But interesting, way out in the last couple of years, you'll see the wildfire acres have gone up, and the amount of prescribed fire came down, except for one major year. But they said that what that really is that because of the history that they have had of, or that 30-year period of doing so much prescribed burning and reducing the likelihood of wildfires, that they were now able more frequently, when a wildfire did occur, to manage it rather than worrying about suppressing it. And they got a lot of prescribed burn acres that they would have done by managing those wildfires under the much better ecological conditions that they had. So very interesting information. Let me switch gears for a couple of minutes to talk about the fire combustion process. And here, many of you are chemists, I suspect, or have chemistry in your background somewhere. So I will apologize if I've oversimplified some things here, but there's two fire triangles that people in fire management are concerned with. The first one is the basic one that all fire folks understand, that you cannot have combustion without those three things on the triangle. And that's the basis for so much of the suppression efforts, especially trying to control the fuel, control the heat, or even if you can cover over the fire, the stop, drop, and roll is cutting off the oxygen supply to that burning. So all three of those are important in suppression methods, but they're also important when we think about prescribed burning, because it's the fuel and the heat conditions that we control so well and so much that we'll see a little bit later on that influence the success of those prescribed burns. I love this picture. You notice all the individual flames that are out here detached from the regular flame. An important, just an indicator of what's going on in that combustion process, which is just the reverse of photosynthesis, where the sunlight produces the energy for carbon dioxide and water to be joined into a whole series of molecules, biological molecules of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen together, releasing the oxygen that we all breathe and a little bit of heat. And in combustion, that process, or that arrow, is just switched, but I went ahead and re-switched the whole thing so that in the combustion, all the carbohydrates, the sugars, the cellulose, in the presence of the oxygen that's prevalent out there and some source of heat, which begins to break down those carbon-hydrogen bonds and turns loose carbon dioxide, water, and the immense heat that we see instantaneously that's generated and then drives this whole process. Under absolutely perfect, efficient combustion, carbon dioxide, water, and heat will be the only things produced. But in reality, especially in wildfires and any other kinds of fires burning in structures, there's a huge amount of these PICs, the products of incomplete combustion, that are created in that process, including carbon monoxide, the particulate matter that you all deal with, and then a whole bunch of other things that are somewhere in between those. Most of those bunches of other things are just representatives of incompletely combusted carbon and hydrogen breakdowns, where there are still multiple carbons in different molecules. A great deal of energy of all forms that are produced in that process. And it's the same process as decay and decomposition of everything else, just at a much lower time scale. Kind of delving into that just a little bit, because these are important, understanding these things, because they are part of what we do in managing fire, the ignition process, and trying to manage the smoke. But when you first apply that match to it, or a drop of fuel, or whatever else is the first heat source to the fuel, it begins to raise the temperature, and pyrolysis begins, which doesn't require oxygen, but it begins to break down those bonds in the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen bonds in the real long molecules. And things like waxes and oils and extractives begin to volatilize. Some of those recondense above it. Some are consumed then immediately as ignition occurs, and that whole process transfers and translates over to a flaming combustion, where temperatures get up to be over about 600 degrees Fahrenheit. From here on in the combustion process, the heat that is released by that combustion is what drives the rest of the process. You don't need to put anything else on it. In the flaming combustion, surface temperatures are listed there. All these combustible volatiles that have been coming up out of the fuel source are now into flame. And if you could track that flame in that picture all the way back down to the base of it, you would see that the flame is not actually attached to the fuel. It's above the fuel, where all these volatiles are going through that much more complete combustion and breakdown process. But like I said, and as you're all familiar with, not everything breaks down. There's incompletely degraded compounds. And these combine in various forms. They just exist there, or is embedded stuff that's in the smoke that we see above the fire. When there's not sufficient oxygen or heat to continue to drive that flaming combustion, but the fuels are still, especially larger fuels, by now grasses and leaves and everything's all burned up, but the larger fuels are still going through pyrolysis and combustion. It's just the gases can't get out fast enough to maintain that flame, and because of buildup on the surface of the carbon and the char on it. And those processes will continue and continue to break down what's left of the fuel. You get more complete carbon dioxide and water production, but also a lot of ash, because that's kind of what's left on the surface. And it's at this stage where large quantities of smoke are, especially large quantities, are coming out of that fuel, because there is no longer combustion of what escapes out of the fuel into the air above it. So real quickly, kind of a graphic of that, you get the initial pre-ignition stage, you get flaming production, and then you get, without flame, you get smoldering and glowing. And I put this up just to emphasize that the aftermath of that flaming combustion is that, and in California they're facing is 200,000 or 300,000 acres of material that's in this smoldering and glowing phase, producing lots of smoke, lots of carbon monoxide, as well as the more regular product of carbon dioxide. So in that smoke, there's a lot of constituents. You all know what these are. I'm not going to go through those. The reason I include this slide is that bottom bullet, because it's such a major driver of what we do in prescribed burning. That's the amount of smoke produced by the volume that is burned increases for low intensity fires in moist or living fuels and high rates of spread. You would think that with high rates of spread, they would be more efficient, but it's actually less efficient combustion, because it often leaves that smoldering heavier fuels behind rather than thoroughly combusting them. And so that last bullet, those two items there are the key items as we put together a prescribed burning plan to try and reduce that amount of smoke per volume by being sure about fuel moisture and being sure that our ignition techniques don't lead to very high rates of spread. So there's one more graphic of it, and what we're here's the preheating going on out over here as the fire moves from right to left, the flaming process and the process behind it. And our role as prescribed burn managers is to make sure we know what the conditions are out here that are going to influence what this flaming combustion is doing, and that we've got the ability to try and reduce this factor as much as possible. The second fire triangle, which is deals a lot more directly with that spread rate that we just got done talking about, or the fire behavior itself, are fuels, which we had of the same thing. But the other two things are the weather and the topography that drive not only how fire behavior occurs, but what we can do in prescribed burning to make sure that we keep fire spread and fire behavior within reasonable conditions that will accomplish the goals we're after. So for example, if you wanted to burn an area really fast, you could light your prescribed fire at the bottom of the hill, but that's way, way more dangerous and probably won't accomplish the objectives compared to trying to light it up at the top of the hill and work down. And all those things will weigh into the prescriptions that are developed. So a little bit on the pattern of fire spread under thinking about those three parts of the second fire triangle. If you had just a point source, a match dropped, a bit of fuel dropped there, a lightning ignition on a tree, that with no other conditions, the fire will burn in the direction of the wind, obviously, and burn much more quickly in the direction of the wind, but it will go backwards. And that's very, very important to know and understand. The flank vectors, these two vectors from that point there, are things that are controlled by the wind speed in one condition, as well as the fuels themselves. And so in much lighter fuels, that vector spreads out considerably. And heavier fuels, it is more concentrated in a long cigar-shaped ellipse rather than a wide spreading fanned ellipse. Now, that's for a single spot, but as you'll see in a minute, a lot of our ignition is actually done as lines of fuel going all the way down here, or as a series of spots spread out through the landscape. And so you get interacting effects of this kind of basic fire spread model. I just put that on a real life picture. We for an example in class that indicated what would happen if a lightning strike came down this tree, ignited the fuel around it, and the wind was blowing from left to right, and that's the pattern it goes. It spreads out going with the wind, but you'll notice it was backing in this direction. And it reaches, depending upon the fuel and the weather condition, a steady spread rate. It will not keep accelerating only up to a point that's governed by the fuels and the weather conditions. And again, that's an important part then as we prescribe different ignition techniques for a prescribed burn. Spread rate is also obviously driven by the wind. The Behave Plus Fire Behavior Model is a common tool that a lot of prescribed burn managers will use to test out what they could expect to happen depending on the fuel they were using and at different wind speeds that they might want favored on their burn. The green line are the tall grasses, things like Kogan grass across the south, sawgrass up in or down at the south end of Florida. The red bar or line is the lower grasses that often occurred in things like the longleaf pine ecosystems. And the blue line are shrub systems, palmetto, gallberry kinds of systems and hardwoods that are across a lot of the Gulf coastal plain. I drew the vertical yellow bar at 10 miles an hour and the red bar at 20 miles an hour. The wind speed may have doubled, but the rate of spread of those fires was somewhere between 2 and 3 times higher at 20 than it was at 10. And I just wanted you to have that picture in your mind as we talk about what kinds of weather conditions are favored for doing prescribed burning in a little bit. So let me ask if there's any quick questions that somebody might have. We'll take a couple of those and then try and go through the last 20 minutes or so and leave a lot of time for questions at the end.
All right, thanks, Alan. You can either type in your questions in the Q&A box in Zoom, or you can also type them in the webinar chat window, and we'll go ahead and field those now. Alan, we had one question that came in during your presentation, and it was submitted without a name, so I don't know who we're going to respond to, but it says, can you review the fire triangle, please? Just the graphic would be fine. So if you want to see if you can get to your slide and just cover the fire triangle one more time.
Which one? Number 1 or number 2?
This says number 2.
Number 2. Okay.
Yeah.
That's that one there. Can y'all see that okay, David?
Yeah, I can see it. It's not in presentation mode, but we can still see the slide.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So those spread rates, for example, that last graph I showed for wind speeds is how fire spread occurs at different winds. All fire managers go through several courses in studying this fire triangle because these are the 3 elements that regulate how a fire will behave and how it will spread. Fuels, obviously, the more fuels you get, the denser they are, the types of fuels they are, adds up to what's called fuel loading, the amount of fuel that's actually available to burn and the amount of smoke then that will be produced. But also important on that fuel side is how dry is it, how moist is it. The moister the fuel, the less efficiently it burns. Those conditions of the fuels are regulated in part by the weather, by how dry the air is, the relative humidity of the air, the wind speeds that are in it, the temperatures. The higher the temperature, the more those fuels on the left get heated up and the quicker they will ignite. And those 2 processes are significantly influenced by topography. You get differences in size and type of fuel from the bottom of the slope to the top of the slope. If you take that other graph I had here, and looking at the, take that ellipse with the fire burning on the side, if that's burning with the wind, but you could take that same ellipse and plant it on the side of a slope, and it's going to have the same effect. It's going to go much faster up the slope because that preheating, that pre-ignition of the fuels above the fire now has flames leaning towards it to try and make it go faster. So the position on the slope, the steepness of the slope are all critical, and then the vegetation changes as you go up or down the slope are all things that are interrelated in this fire triangle of how fire behaves and how it acts.
Can I add to that, Alan?
Yes.
You know, in that fire behavior triangle with fuels, weather, and topography, one of the reasons this comes up in prescribed fire is often used as a way to manage fuels to reduce wildfire behavior. And the reason this fire behavior triangle would come up in that discussion is because if we're thinking in terms of mitigating wildfire behavior or wildfire effects or risk, the only thing that we can actually modify in this fire behavior triangle are the fuels. Right. We can't control the weather, and we can't usually control the topography.
Absolutely not on the topography side of it. But we can select within the full range of weather and topography conditions how we do the fire, which is kind of the second half of this webinar today. So,
so I don't want to get into the weeds here. We had a couple more questions come in. One, somebody asked through the Q&A section, do different states regulate the use or purposes of prescribed fires differently? And if you want to answer that one now or save that one for the next part of your presentation.
Yeah, I've got a couple slides right at the very end. But I will say this, the view about doing prescribed fire is pretty similar all across the South. The state's view and the way they regulate it is considerably more complex when you get in the Western states, because they haven't been thinking about prescribed fire as a control method. It's been so, and when you have years like this, especially the last 2 months in California and previous to that, further to the north, they don't want to think about putting any other fire on the ground unless they can, but it's changing. As we found at the Congress here a couple of weeks ago in Orlando, there's a lot of folks in a lot of places other than the South that are definitely getting much more involved in using prescribed fire for just these reasons of reducing wildfire risk and controlling the fuel loads out there. Across the South, the regulations still vary by how the permitting or authorization process is put out, how intensely they require training out of different burn manager certification programs. But as I'll point out in the very last two slides, most of them have some of the same components, and they have pretty much a same outlook on it. It's just the policies haven't been written or adjusted to all look uniform yet.
A couple of the questions we had. Washington State Fire Ecology wrote in and said, can you describe how fire behavior varies based on different forest types? So there's a whole book right there.
Yeah, it does. And that picture, for example, on the left, I had used it earlier when I was talking about how imperceptibly fuel conditions or vegetation changes and gets more dense. So the same thing will hold out west as it does down here, that is forests like lodgepole pine, as when they get very dense after a huge reseeding effort, and then as they get old enough and dry out, and die out, they will be a much more rapidly burning fuel than will be those open ponderosa pines that you have on the east side of the Cascades. The west side, the Douglas fir forests actually have all the fuel conditions you need for burning really well, but very, very seldom is the weather sufficient to carry any fire through those kinds of stands. So yes, it's still a matter of the fuels, the vegetation in them, but also then the weather conditions that influence those fuels. And send me an email sometime and we'll talk some more. I spent a couple of years out in Washington. I'd like to be certainly willing to share off the call in some way. Maybe we had to move on,
Yep,
Dave.
let's move on.
Okay, let me find my spot. So the rest of this then, I would like to first talk about ignition methods, and then we'll go to the planning process of how prescribed burners work their way through that. So there's a number of different ways of actually igniting a fire and getting it going. And it all goes back to thinking about those fuels that you have and the way fire will spread from the ignition points. It's true to say that in any burn unit and any burn manager that is doing what they're supposed to do, which is, I think everybody does this, is that the important part here is the wind direction and where it's coming from, and that you always go to the downwind side, down to this cultivated field or this road or whatever you have as a fuel break on the downwind side of the burn. And you light that first, and you light it as a backing fire so that it will move slowly away, just as it did from that tree that I had in the example. It moves slowly away from that line and blackens or burns out the fuels that are up against the field or the road. And depending on the fuel type, the weather conditions, will regulate how much of that blackened zone you want to create before you start doing the other ignition techniques. Now, if you've got a unit that you really don't want to do anything but a backing fire, remember that was a lower flame, lower intensity, as we saw in a couple of those graphics. And so, for example, some really heavy fuels, that might be the very best thing to do. Heavy shrub patches would be initially to put a backfire through it, but a backfire moves very, very slowly. And so if you lit this unit without any interior fire lines, as you have over here, and you started it burning just as a backfire, it would take it all day or 2 days or 3 days to work its way up across this unit. So one way, if you've got a fuel in a condition that needs backfires, you can use a whole series of internal plow lines or fire lines and light a backfire from each one of those. And that fire will just gradually work its way into the wind across each of those units and complete itself in a reasonable period of time. If the fuels and the weather will allow it, a much quicker route to do that is to blacken all of this out and then do the same thing that the picture on the left is doing, is light a line of fire with a drip torch or some other tool all the way across here and let it burn in both directions. And obviously against the wind, this side of that line will be backing up this way, but with the wind, it will be moving much more rapidly down into this blackened zone. And so very quickly, it creates a much broader blackened zone as this converges with this, and then this converges with this. And you get across that fire or that burn unit much more quickly. It generates the smoke more quickly, but it also generates the smoke with a lot of convectional heat that pushes it up and gets the smoke up into the dispersion zones and the transport zone. Burning like this will not produce enough convection to get the smoke lifted high into the transport winds. And so that becomes a factor also as you're thinking about smoke management. It's part of that balancing of getting enough ignition to get the thorough combustion that you want, as well as smoke dispersion without creating problems. But backing fires are usually used just for this black line. Strip heads are used very often because you can cover large blocks with it. If the strip head isn't going to work, another option is, instead of using that straight line of fire all the way across, is to put it in as a series of spots. And rather than having one long flaming front of fire, you create a whole series of these spots of fire, as again as in that picture around the tree that we had. Each of them sort of burning together, and the proper spacing for doing that is you plan for these burns to come together just about the same time that they reach the backfire or the previous line of fire, so you never have large running fires. And you can burn, usually a burner may go from burning like this earlier in the day when fuel conditions haven't dried out quite as much, and then later in the day as it gets warmer or drier, they'll go to this method as a way of using the weather to help you adapt your fire to managing it the way you want it. And under other conditions, one other way to do this is to run a series of what they call flank fires instead, where you ignite a line of fire directly into the wind and it burns out in a series of V's. Again, you don't start that until after you've burned this black line down at the downwind side of it. This is is often used in flat lands and shrub fields as a way of keeping control, but it's one that you have to be very concerned about in terms of safety for keeping your crews lined up together. It does a very effective job on slopes also as a way of controlling fire spread on those slopes. And then one last technique is called the ring fires. You won't find people doing this in the woods, hardly at all. Maybe in some very, very small spots that they're creating some openings. But it is a good way on a lot of agricultural fields and pasture lands to do it because they're dealing with low grasses on it. And you want it to burn fast. And again, you do it the black line on the downwind side. Start a fire out in the middle of the unit somewhere so you can get some convection pulling, because as that air rises above that burning spot, it pulls air in from the other sides to replace it. And what you can create is kind of a suction in the middle, light it all around the outside, and it burns very quickly into that middle spot, which does great on especially on short grasses. So those are probably the main ignition methods. The question is, how do you do all those? The drip torch is the most common method, and usually by hand is on the left, but there are some folks, especially in the past, who've done it off of horses. There's a couple of places in Florida where those horses are still used and some very, very good burners. In fact, a number of my pictures came from the fellow on the horse, Steve Miller. You can light that torch on the side of a RV or four-wheeler, not an RV, four-wheeler, and use that to drive across the unit and use those lines and drive it up and down the roads to put flank fires on the sides of the burn. You can mount that thing on with a lot more fuel on the back of a helicopter or the side of a helicopter and use that. Not very common unless you're burning very large blocks of land where it just would not be feasible to get people out in it. And maybe you cannot get a four-wheeler to it. And then there's one other helicopter technique that is used. It's the ping pong ball method. This dispenser on the left shoots out ping pong balls filled with potassium permanganate. They get an injection with glycol just as they're dispensing from the machine. And the pattern you get is a series of these spot fires, as in that spot fire ignition technique. Again, the ways and the frequency with which those ping pong balls are shot out is dependent on the weather and the fuel that day. So these are the main methods. There's all kinds of adaptations, especially of the drip torch and four-wheelers. All right, requirements for burning. And this is where most of the state agencies will all agree with this, is that you have to, kind of answering that last question we had a minute ago, that if you're going to do this correctly and properly, you need a written fire plan, and it has to show that you went through some sort of a smoke screening process. And that's in the plan that you put together before you ever go do the burning. It's what you decided, and you put that together and you say, okay, now I've got to watch for those conditions to be able to burn that site that under those sort of conditions. And then when you get ready to do the burning, you have to make sure that you got the weather forecast and whether or not those current conditions actually match up with what you said you needed through the smoke screening process. In most states, you have to have some sort of a permit. In some states, a local agency may issue that. More often in the South, it's the state agencies that do it. But the conditions under those vary. In some states, it's an open permit to burn over the next some period of time. Places like Florida, and I think most of the coastal plain states, has a permit that you receive the day before, the night of, or the morning of the burn itself. And then you have to have sufficient methods of keeping that fire within its lines. And I think that people do that is attested to by that very, very low escape frequency that I showed early in the slides. Part of that planning process that in developing a written plan includes some sort of a statement of objectives of why it is you're doing this burning. Is it for wildfire reduction, risk reduction? Is it for protecting or encouraging habitat for wildlife? What are the main reasons you're doing the burning? And then some sort of reconnaissance of it. We'll look more closely at in a minute. And then you develop and write the prescription and test that prescription, especially for smoke against things like fire behave plus the fire behave model, against smoke projection models, where will the smoke go? You put that whole prescription together. If it's a large enough unit, especially for federal agencies, some state agencies, you have to develop some additional plans tied to safety of crews and the people that reside in that area. Holding actions for how are you going to make sure it stays within the boundaries that you want. How are you going to mop it up to reduce that smoldering and glowing stage at the end of the ignition process? And what happens if it does go wrong? Then there may be some pre-burn site preparation. It may not have a wide enough road or a wide enough trail there that you want dividing non-burn units with what it is that you want to burn, and so you have to do that ahead of time. The reconnaissance includes what types of vegetation are out there, what's the conditions of those fuels, do I have some topographical, some hills, some slopes that I need to deal with, and how will I deal with those? Is there infrastructure I should worry about? Actually, you can't see it, but on the back side of those trees out there is a huge, big University of Florida Conference Center that you do not want to run your prescribed fire into. The opposite, and beyond that, about 4 miles away, is the Gainesville Airport. So those are the kind of special concern features. And you always have some sort of a plan that you can show the crew that's going to be working, that as on the bottom there, that says, here's how we're going to ignite it. Here's the safety ground to go to in case something goes wrong. Here's the directions we're expecting the wind from. We'll do a test fire, and you always do a test fire to make sure it's actually going to behave the way you want it to. And if it doesn't, you shut it down and don't go on. The prescription looks something like this. This is a one-pager, a fairly simple one. It's in a book I'll show you in a minute. But on it, you list all these things, and you'll find somewhere in that fine print the objectives of it. What are the stand conditions? What fuel types are out there? What are the desired effects? Do I want to burn everything? Do I want to burn the trees too? Probably not, but it all depends on what it is you're trying to control. What are the effects I expect out of that? And given those results and effects I want, what sorts of fuel and weather conditions do I need? Do I want it drier and warmer with a little bit more wind, or do I want it moisture with a little bit less wind? What are the conditions I want? Which of those ignition methods will I use? The concerns about smoke management. What will I have on site in terms of equipment to handle this? Who do I need to contact both before and during? And that map that I said you need. Excuse me a minute. In general, for most of those prescriptions, you can say that the preferred weather conditions are these things that are listed down here. They're the conditions that allow a controlled development of the fire, to spread the way you want it, and to disperse the smoke acceptably. Remember, I mentioned for things like if you did just strictly a backing burn, that you likely would not be dispersing the smoke except on the ground in the wind direction of the wind. So those are the sort of things that fit into this. And that's why the preferred conditions say a slightly unstable atmosphere. Something where there is some kind of convectional lift that as you heat up the surface and the fuels are burning, that smoke will be carried up instead of straight downwind on the surface. You need some sort of mid-flame wind speed. If you have absolutely no wind blowing, you have absolutely no control of the fire. You have to have wind on it in order to make those ignition techniques work the way you want. And notice it's below that 10 miles per hour in most cases, which was that yellow line on the fire behave graph that I showed. Transport wind speeds, on the other hand, you want to be higher than that. Those are the winds higher up that are moving that smoke column downwind. And there you would like it to be able to get up and have some to disperse. Again, if you had no transport wind, it just means that it's all going to rise straight up. And then as it cools, it's all going to come back down again. Temperature is less than 70 degrees, although there's parts of the south and during the warmer seasons of the year where it gets above that. So you also have to have preferred conditions that will take that into consideration, maybe with higher humidity. At higher humidity, the fuels are at that higher moisture content. They aren't going to burn as efficiently, but that may be a good thing if you're trying to burn really heavy and dense fuels. And recent precipitation is good, not to necessarily to wet the fuels up, but to be sure that the organic matter in the soil is moist so that you don't get it started burning, which will just be as a smoldering fire. Kind of the reverse of that are things to ignore. Don't burn under these conditions. A great deal of instability means you're going to get a lot of that convectional suction into your fire, creating not only instability in the atmosphere, but unstable winds on your fire itself. Surface winds less than 20 miles per hour, relative humidity is less than 20%, and fuel moisture is less than 5%. All of these you can mix and match depending on your fuel and what the conditions are and what you're trying to achieve in your objectives. Some other conditions definitely to avoid if you don't have enough people and equipment to do the job. If the Gainesville Airport is actually right next to your burn and the wind's going that way. And especially if you do not have a plan or a permit, because then you're likely to have problems. It's not that private landowners cannot burn without those, but they have absolutely no protection if something does go wrong and they run into a liability issue. On the smoke management side of this, that part is a plan of action for making sure that we minimize local effects and contributions into the region. 3 basic objectives: identify the smoke-sensitive areas and avoid those things like highways, hospitals, senior citizen residential halls, airports, a number of different things that will fit that. And then you want to make sure that you either change your plan so those will not receive smoke, or you handle your fire in a way that the smoke will get dispersed out of the way before it reaches those areas. And then reduce emissions per unit area, which goes back to that combustion process I said of trying to balance fuel conditions and combustion intensity so that you get as much and as complete a combustion as you can and fewer of those picks that are rolling around in the atmosphere. There's a 5-step screening process that's pretty basic to all training in the South and probably most every place else. Plot the trajectory of the smoke, identify those downwind sensitive areas, especially the critical ones like the hospital right next to your burn. Determine if the fuel loads or what the fuel load is. As you get above 10 tons per acre, you begin to generate a lot more of the heavier smoke, and then minimize the risk of that smoke. And so, for example, projecting smoke, and this is just, remember, this is putting your plan together before you get to the day that you're going to do the burning. And so that green box is burn. We were planning, we wanted to do it on a southwest wind, which would, you put down where your burn is, and this is the old ruler method, and you draw that line out in the direction of the prevailing wind or the wind for that day, and 2 lines 30 degrees, and use that as your cone for looking to see if there's any smoke sensitive areas out here. And about 3 miles away is Highway 301. So that is a consideration depending on how much you're burning. But that's better that way than the slightly shorter distance down here to the airport. So those are the things you're looking for. This is a very simple method. That method has been modeled onto the computer in something called the Simple Smoke Screening Model. And I suspect a fair number of you may have seen this or used it. It was off the web for a couple of years, and we just got it reestablished on the southernfireexchange.org website. But it does the same thing as that other model, but does it with a little bit more information. You put in how many acres you're going to burn, whether it's a grass or one of 3 other fuel types, whether you're burning with a backing fire or a head fire, and then the direction of the prevailing wind. You hit the update map model, and it produces a cone that looks like this from your burn site, with the red part of the cone, orange part of the cone indicating more intense effects of that smoke, more localized effects, and then less effects as you go further out in that yellow cone. That's a very simple model. It's easy for a lot of people to use that. As you get into larger burns and fire agencies, there won't be many people that actually do use that. You can also take that map and overlay it on a Google Earth map, and you can get a little more detail into what's downwind from your burn. One other method that is commonly used by a lot of people that's on the web is a vSmoke web. It's I listed the website up there. Oops. Excuse me a minute. I don't know if you could hear that, but the dog was barking. So. And it produces then a series of cones that display the amount of smoke according to the air quality index colors and values. It's got the same two ignition methods, but it lists 12 different fuel types. It provides the tons per acre for those fuel types on the average. You put in whether this is going to be dry, moist, or very moist conditions. And then it tells you how much of the fuel is actually going to be consumed. So there's three ways that most burn managers can access to project where the smoke is going. Many other, not many other, but several other models, a lot more detailed technically, are also available that some of the state agencies use. As far as minimizing smoke, here's a whole list of things that can be used to try and minimize those effects from the test fires that I already talked about to make sure that the fire is going to do what you want it to do. Backing fires give you more complete combustion, but it takes all day and the smoke doesn't get high into the transport zone. And all these others, mixing heights more than 1,600 feet, transport wind speeds, all of these factors that are listed here are things that you can take into consideration in your burn plan that will try and reduce the amount of smoke you produce and the impacts of it. Some night burning is still done, but it's only under very constrained conditions and making sure that it will be a night where it blows wind all night and the relative humidities don't hit dew point. There's a number of guidebooks and resources that are available for landowners to use that are tied to smoke management. This Introduction to Prescribed Fire is sort of the Bible of burning in the South. It goes back 40 years, maybe 50 years. It's been through a number of renditions. This is the most recent one. It's available through a link on our website or the Forest Service Southern Research Station. Here's a couple of fact sheets on smoke, on superfog, and the basic smoke management practices that the Southern Fire Exchange put together. We have a number of others on some of the computer models that are available. The basic smoke management practices is also available in modified form through the SERPPAS Prescribed Fire Smoke Management Pocket Guide. And it's been included, the basic smoke management practices have been included in a number of EPA rules that have come out recently. And Rick may be able to talk a little bit more about those. Kind of one last example, we've put together this photo series guide that allows a burn manager to use a whole series of photos to guesstimate what the fuel loads will be in that burn so he can do a better job of managing it. A new one that will be out very, very shortly for designed specifically for private landowners is this book, A Step-by-Step Guide to Smoke Management. And you'll all be seeing notices of when that's available. A lot of pages, a lot of detail. It's an excellent, excellent new book that's coming out. Those basic smoke management practices, and I'll close on this, are making sure that you do all the things we've talked about, evaluating dispersion conditions, monitoring the effects, recording what you're doing and how you're doing it, keeping a good track record of what your burn is about, notifying authorities and neighbors, utilizing that long list of emission reduction techniques, and then working with other landowners in the area who may be burning. Now, in some states, that's probably the best way for that to happen. In Florida, the authorization process is one where the Florida Forest Service, when you call in for a permit, they plot it on a map and they tell you if there's a whole bunch of other people burning near you, and that may be the basis for whether you are authorized or not. So, so the last thing, since somebody asked about this, the history of prescribed burning legislation began in Florida, although it was being people were doing burning in Florida a lot farther back than that, but it kind of was legalized in terms of a protection for people who went through a process to be certified burn managers. In 1990, it established burning as a property right in the public interest, provided liability protection for certified burn managers. And that being certified, you had to go through training, had to go through experience, and had to have a write-off that you were finally qualified, and then you go through continuing education on that process. In 1999, it went through some major revisions after the 98 fires. Probably one of the more interesting, probably the major thing it did for burners was it changed the liability class from being just negligent to grossly negligent, which is a much stronger legal protection. But interestingly, it also required the Department of Education to begin to incorporate issues of prescribed burning in curriculum. So there's been some other additions, and I guess I wanted to close on that last line that most of the other southern states have some similar kinds of laws. Some of them have a little bit more detail, some have a little bit less, and various requirements as far as the authorization and the certifying burn managers goes. And so with that, I think we've left hopefully sufficient time for some questions.
All right, thanks, Alan. If you joined us during the webinar or a little bit later after we started, there was a presentation on prescribed burning and controlled burning for air quality specialists and folks new to the area with Dr. Alan Long. He's the director guy of the Southern Fire Exchange. And so we do have time left in our hour for questions. You can type them into the chat window or submit them through the Zoom Q&A box. And we had a couple of links that went up in the chat window while Alan was giving his presentation. So you can scroll up and see links to some of the smoke model pages and the SERPPAS smoke app. And also we put up links to the YouTube webinar archive where this recording will be posted. And also if you're interested in getting SAF CFE credit for participating. So Alan, we had one question come in and someone is through the Q&A box and somebody's asking, are there any federal rules or laws related to prescribed burning on lands outside of federal property?
Oh, outside of federal property, I don't believe so, because Rick and Scott may be better answering this, but I believe it's because the smoke process, the smoke and air quality issues are governed through the Clean Air Act, but they're actually handled at the state level through the requirements for protecting them through what the states have to accomplish in their smoke management programs. They do have requirements probably beyond what the general requirements are for burning that's done on federal lands. Certainly their planning process tends to be much more thorough and detailed than it is for a lot of the lands in the South. Do you want me to share this back with you, David, so you can show any of those other things?
Not yet. That way,
okay.
In case we have questions, you want to refer to a slide.
Okay.
So here's another question that came in for smoke management. Does your information for the public include air quality? If it does, has any written brochures or pamphlets been developed, which includes fire necessity, smoke management, and air quality? That's a good question.
That's a great question. And I guess the answer is yes, there have been various things that have been prepared that they probably, and I know the EPA has had some of these through the more intense and the larger documents and guidelines that have been produced and are on the EPA site. I think what has been done from those is attempts at various times by extension agents or extension service in different states, by state agencies in different states to use those materials as a basis for talking about air quality. I certainly know, I know it's gone on in the West, but it's because of trying to deal with and help folks with the air quality through all these very large wildfires that occur and the very real smoke issues that they have with those.
So here's an interesting question. It actually comes up kind of a lot. And from Evans, it would seem that having ideal conditions for burning would occur infrequently. Generally, how often, he's throwing the quotes up there, would good burn days come around?
So, well, ideally, those best burn days are, it's way less frequent than if you took those strictly the way they are. Those are the recommendations, but how we get beyond that, because of the need to burn, do as much prescribed burning as ideally would be done, then you begin to have some flex in those. And so if it says temperatures under 70 degrees, that's designed to keep the fuels, having the heavier fuels and the larger fuels from not warming up quite so much if you want to protect them and not have them burn while you're burning the understory. But you can move that out to 80 or 85 degrees if you also have fuels that are reasonably moist. And so it's a case of beginning to balance all the different factors in terms of temperature, humidity, winds, and some of the other climatic or weather kinds of conditions, so that you can still be able to burn beyond those. And it probably would be surprising that there actually are far more good burn days than those numbers indicate, if you went by them very, very strictly. But I don't know if that helps, but there's the ability to balance and to trade off conditions to try and still keep the smoke going in the direction you want and get the kind of the maximum burning accomplished for the objectives you have.
Yeah, it depends on your fuels, it depends on your location, and it depends on your prescription.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, if you are boxed in and you can only send your smoke one direction, well, then you're limited to the number of days per year that you can send the smoke that direction.
Yeah. Now, in places like, and I use Fort Benning as an example, but there's a lot of other very large private landowners that are that do considerable amount of burning, maybe several hundred burns each year, and they'll have planned out ahead of time what kinds of weather conditions they need for those, to accomplish those particular burns. And they'll probably save the ones that are most going to be most difficult for those very best days that they get them. And when those best days arrive, they say, okay, we'll go take units A, B, and C today and save these other ones for conditions that are just a little bit less than ideal.
Alan, we have a question here in Atlanta.
Yeah.
Hi, EPA has a BurnWise program, which is utilized as a strategy for keeping and reducing the amount of particulate matter. And that program, while there's different phases to it, but yeah, part of it is how you're burning wood inside your home, but it also applies to the types of wood and the moisture in that wood that's used in bonfires and outdoor different events and so forth. And you know, the moisture in the wood is one of the things that they talk about, the wood. And depending on that moisture, if it's higher, you're definitely going to have more PM exposure. I was just wondering, between this program and EPA's BurnWise program, is there any kind of cooperation between the two objectives?
I can't say explicitly that there is. If there is, I don't know about it. Maybe Rick or Scott might have some ideas on that. I do know that we don't, when we get ready to burn in that unit that's, for example, in the picture out there, that virtually all of that standing wood is, none of that is going to burn. And so that it doesn't become an issue with that. 90% of the fuels are these grasses and shrubs and brush down below, except for things like this dead tree in the middle. And probably back here behind the smoke at various places are some logs laying down. And those are the things that will smolder and will produce a huge amount of particulate matter. They're also the things that we try to, when we ask for or suggest that it'd be good to have precipitation a few days before the burning, with the intent that the precipitation will moisten that wood up enough that even though it may smolder at one end or the other, it largely will not burn and release all that particulate matter. Most of the particulate matter is coming from the smoldering grass and the fine fuels that's back out in these smoky areas here. And yeah, I'm not sure whether that directly relates into what you're asking about or not.
Yeah, this is Rick Gillum. I just would comment that, yeah, I'm not aware that there's any direct relationship between the programs, since one's focused more on outdoor air and you're talking about more the burn-wise where you're intentionally burning wood for either heating purposes or recreational purposes. However, the same science that Alan covered in this webinar applies with the consideration of moisture of the fuel and the conditions in the atmosphere that are occurring, and you would try and do the burning when it minimizes the amount of PM and air pollutants. I guess that's the only comment I would have.
Yeah. Thanks, Rick.
And I have one other question. If it relates to those conditions for burns, if you have a good day, I'm assuming the state coordinates the number of permits it issues, that not that you have everybody out there doing a bunch of them all over the place. The combination there of it, all the little ones could be huge.
Yeah. It's true. On a very good burn day, if you drive south from Atlanta and head for the Florida border, you will see lots of smoke coming up in lots of different places. But that part of that very good burn day is probably based on the fact that there's good transport winds, and it's going to move it and disperse it across a lot more territory than being focused. So that, I guess that's one answer. The first part of your question just skipped me.
Well, I was just wondering, I mean, how do the states manage the number?
Yes, yeah, that's right. Well, for example, I mentioned Florida, and I'm pretty sure Georgia does it the same way, that they're issuing those authorizations either the night before or the morning of the burns, and they're keeping track. You tell them when you call in for that authorization, it says it's going to be over here in this corner of Alachua County or that corner of DeKalb County or wherever, and then they're recording all those, and they either have on a map, and in Florida they've got it all on a smoke projection map that's tied to the Weather Service forecast, and they can see where, and they ask how big is your area, are you burning 100 acres or 20 acres, and so they can project out how much smoke is going to come out from each of those, and they will get to the point if there's too many of them all burning the same way and they're going to be smoke heading for Gainesville or Tallahassee, that they will stop issuing authorizations for those days.
Yeah,
Thank you.
This is Rick. I would concur with that. Yeah, definitely. Georgia does that same thing, Alan. Florida's system is more advanced and computerized, but Georgia does have staff that looks at that when they're doing permit issues. So.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure some of the other states around Georgia are doing the same thing to some degree.
South Carolina, North Carolina, Alabama to some degree, yeah.
Yeah.
And here's a question. This may be more for Scott and Rick. Came in from John in the chat window. He says, is there any evidence that prescribed fires have played a substantial role in any of the southeastern states' inability to comply with national ambient air quality standards?
Yeah, this is Rick. I guess the short answer to that is no. We don't have any current non-attainment areas for PM, for particulate matter and ozone, that we've found any kind of direct link between prescribed fire and the cause or contribution to those areas. And so to me, that is a testament to what Alan has covered in this webinar, is that there are millions of acres that are being prescribed burned every year, and all of these procedures that are being followed, and they're done in a way such to minimize the smoke and make sure it's not impacting the populated areas. So, that, to my knowledge, we don't have any direct link. There have been situations where large wildfires have been shown to cause exceedances of the NACs for PM and ozone at the monitoring locations, and there are rules and ways to deal with that, like the exceptional events rule, which we could talk about in a different forum. We don't have time for that.
But yeah, all of our states, they do, because of their monitoring systems being comprehensive, they're able to actually track when there are these wildfire events. They can actually see how that impacts the air quality in those particular areas on those particular monitors. They do a very good job of being able to see and trace those back to those specific events if they need them for any type of regulatory relief.
We had another question come in. Interesting. From Cindy, she asked, we often have stakeholders who are concerned about the potassium permanganate use. Are you aware of any environmental concerns that persist after those for ignition?
I am not, but that's probably just negligence and not having looked into it. And it's such a small amount. Picture a ping pong ball, and distributing a couple of hundred of those across an acre. Mm-hmm. But I would be interested. I would be glad to hear or know something about what kinds of potential damage or problems potassium permanganate has.
And Diana asks through the chat window, I'm currently developing a smoke brochure for my agency. Do you have a link or a list for smoke brochures from other states that you know
of? We do not have that list. The SERPPAS website is working on some of those. You could put that together, or go to their website. What is it, David? It's Southeastern Fire.
Yep.
Trying to think.
I'll find it and pull it up and put it in there.
Yeah. Some of the state agencies have them. If I believe if you looked at the Florida Forest Service webpage, for example, they would, I believe, under their public education side of it, they've got some smoke. If they're not brochures, there's at least some information there on that. Now, at the same time as I say that, though, there is a growing and increasing effort with the Cooperative Extension Service in the South to look at what can we be doing as sort of the next great stage for fire and wildland fire, prescribed fire education for the public. And brochures like that would fit right into the wheelhouse for the sort of things that they do. And if you want to try and communicate with David and I separately, I'd sure be happy to hook you up with some of the people that are working on that effort. In fact, we've got a conference call this afternoon if you want to join it. But.
Okay. Yeah, and the group that Alan was talking about, it's the Southeast Regional Partnership for Planning and Sustainability, SERPPAS, and it's SERPPAS.org. And I mentioned earlier that Jennifer Fawcett with our work group, she actually is the coordinator for the prescribed fire work group for SERPPAS, and so we can provide information available through the website, and Jen can provide information as well that we can get out.
All right, we'll get to a question here. It came in talking about emission reduction techniques that can be used to reduce or minimize smoke. Could you talk about those and maybe point folks to any resources talking about those emission reduction techniques?
Yeah, let me back up to that list. Probably one place to go to look for this was that was actually, let me go back forward. This introduction to prescribed fire in southern ecosystems has a greatly detailed section on smoke management. As I mentioned, you can link to it through the southernfireexchange.org website or the Southern Research Station. It's a Forest Service publication. And they have a section in there that ought to answer questions and focus on it. It has this same list. In fact, that's where this list initially came from, but it's been modified, I think, in their most recent edition. And so all of these things are understood as ways to try and deal with that. There's probably a number of others that we could add to that list, but things like do not ignite organic soils, there are not a lot of that in Florida, except if you get to the south end of the state and into the Everglades system. Any place in Georgia where there's swamps that will exist, North Carolina's got a lot of them on the east side of the state, and North Carolina and South Carolina. And when fire gets into those, then they start to smolder. There's very seldom flaming combustion and a huge amount of smoke production. But that's part of the reason we say, and most people will try to make sure that they've had some sort of precipitation if they're going to have organic soils on their site, that those organic soils are wetted up before they do the prescribed burn over them. And in the same way, most of these other issues on here are all factors that will, if you think it's going to be a problem for smoke, that it's good to make sure that you do that. You know, if you're only producing a little bit of smoke, you only got 10 acres to burn, it's grass, then the mixing height of being over 1,600 feet isn't going to be an issue because it's not going to go that high. And it's going to not be nearly enough smoke to probably make a difference once it's dispersed. 100 acres of very heavy fuels, on the other hand, that's probably an absolute necessity that you want to make sure that that mixing height is attained, if not a lot, considerably higher than that without getting into unstable atmospheres. So all of these have different roles they will play depending on what kind of burn you're doing, what the conditions are that you're doing in. Does that help? I hope.
You mentioned mixing heights and stability. We had another question come in a little bit earlier. If you could review the concept of unstable atmosphere in the prescription. The question comes in, are you referring to mixing heights? And this person in particular is in Reno and in Nevada. So maybe could you review mixing heights and atmospheric stability a little bit?
Yeah, 1,600 feet is way below the height that they're at.
Yeah, there, but their valley sits at 4,000 feet.
Yeah, that's right. So, yeah, I'm not a meteorologist, but the two issues tied to that is the mixing height is, or the unstable atmosphere is generated by surface heating of whatever surface. In Nevada, that'd be all that prairie east of the Sierras. And as that heats up, air rises naturally, and the more that heats up and there is not, and the atmospheric temperature profile allows that heated air to continue to rise, you get what's called an unstable atmosphere. If instead you have some sort of an inversion layer at 1,000 feet or 3,000 feet where it's cold above that hot air and the air cannot rise through it, then you have a very stable atmosphere that keeps any smoke rising from going very high. And so you'd have to have the instability in order to get up to a reasonable mixing heights, which is the area in which the transport winds, the prevailing above the surface winds, will carry and move the smoke or the air itself. In a very stable atmosphere, if there's not much wind, there may not be either of those, and smoke will not rise at all.
We have a recorded webinar from a couple of years ago on our Southern Fire Exchange YouTube page, and I believe it was Matt Fearon from the Desert Research Institute was our guest, and he, there may have been, it was either Matt or Scott Kudrick, could be confusing the two. But either way, they gave a really in-depth discussion of mixing height and atmospheric stability and dispersion, and how those things are all estimated and linked together. And so if you really want to go down that road, there's a lot to be learned and to wrap your head around, and that's going to be in our webinar archive on our YouTube channel. You'll be able to find that.
Thanks, David.
So it looks like we've covered most of our questions and comments here. I'm going to switch screens, Alan. And finally, here is Alan's contact information, his email address, and mine as well. And if you have any questions, you want to reach out to either of us in the future, please feel free to give us an email, and we'll see what we can do to help you out. So looks like we've run up a little bit over our time, but thanks so much for sticking with us. And thanks, Alan. Really enjoyed your presentation, and thanks again, Rick and Scott, for making this all happen.
Sure. Thank you again, Alan and David. Appreciate all the information, and we look forward to more work here in the Southeast through our Southeast Prescribed Fire and Air Quality Work Group. And once again, appreciate everybody being part of today's webinar.
Yeah, thank you all.
All right, thanks so much. And once again, this was recorded, and if you are interested, you can find the recording on the Southern Fire Exchange YouTube channel. In a couple weeks, we'll have it up in January. So thanks, everybody. Have a good morning, and happy holidays.
Hey.